Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and I am promoting yet another new book of poems. This one's called Thanatos, a poetic history of the dead. And I know I've been putting out a lot of books of poetry lately. I've had a sort of creative explosion. Many of these poems I've had lying around for years in various stages of completion, but I've also been writing them a lot. And once the ball got rolling, it just sort of took control, and the poems are just pouring out of me. Um, so I know a lot of you are probably raising eyebrows about how good can these poems be if he's writing them that fast? And I'll leave that up for you to judge. But I put out Archai, which has now been restored. It's back on Amazon. And I did Gilgamesh, which is actually a novel, but it's done in poetic form. And then I did Orpheus in the World Interior. And now we have Thanatos, and Metapsychosis Press, which is run by Marco Morelli, is about to put out another collection of poems of mine. Most of those are early poems called These Things We No Longer Are. And I have a couple of other poetry collections in the works, including a meditated sort of Miltonic epic about World War II that I'll be working on for quite a while. So I thought what I'd do to promote this is read some of these poems from Thanatos. Now, what Thanatos is, Thanatos, of course, means death, and what it is a history of the cult of the dead. Starting with the earliest burials that we know of took place at Atapuerca, Spain, in a giant cave amongst the proto-Neanderthals, who simply threw their dead into a pit, and they just tossed them in there. So the cave is the birth of the underworld and the beginnings of the disposal of the dead 500,000 years ago. And then we jump ahead to about 100,000 years ago or so, which is the poem I'm going to read here, to where Cro-Magnons have entered into Palestine, and they've migrated out of Africa, and they're beginning to bury their dead, usually using red ochre and contracting the body in a fetal position. The Neanderthals, too, in the same region, and apparently at the time they were cohabiting peacefully for a while, were also burying their dead, but in caves. And most burials for a long time took place in caves. Then as time goes by, and most of the burials are actually shamans, because those are the revered ones of these tribes. And then as you fast forward into the Neolithic, the dead start being buried underneath the floors of the living spaces so that people sleep over the dead. And the cult of the dead ancestors becomes the primary sort of archive. The ruling archive of the society are the ancestral dead. So we get the cult of the skulls. At Jericho, the skull is remodeled so that one can continue to consult the ancestral dead. That goes on all through the Neolithic until eventually in the later Neolithic, the so-called Pottery Neolithic, when cremation first begins to come in, at the same time that ceramics, pottery begins to come in, and at the same time as metallurgy. So all these pyrotechnologies, to borrow a term from Mary Sedegast, all these pyrotechnologies begin to come in, and we start getting the practice of cremation, as well as the practice of separating the dead from the domus and putting them out into separate cemeteries. And moving the dead out into separate cemeteries, I think, was one of the crucial reasons why civilization went forward, because the dead always frown on innovations. They don't like the new. And in order for civilization to get going, it took the practice of moving the dead out of the way, deferring not to the wishes of the dead, but to the living, and innovations begin springing forth, and then we get the innovation of civilization in ancient Ur. We begin to get status burials of kings and queens in the real death pits of Ur that Sir Leonard Woolley found. Same thing happens in Egypt with the first dynasty, with the pharaoh Horha, who becomes the founder of the first dynasty after he's the son of Narmer, who was the first to unify Egypt. And then the Egyptians mummify their dead. Each society has a different practice. The Egyptians preferred mummification, which is tantamount to a will to the future. The Greeks and the Hindus preferred cremation. In the case of the Greeks, cremation comes in as a way of separating the realm of the dead from the realm of the living, because you can't go back to the ashes and revere them. Even though the Mycenaeans before them kept the dead inside of toloi, and the toloi you could walk in and out of and worship the revered dead. So there's a shift there from the Mycenaeans to the Dorians, who bring in the practice of burning of the dead. And then later on, the book ends actually with the Christian practice of the catacombs, which is a kind of retrieval of the old ancient Palestinian and European practice of burying the dead in caves. And so the book walks through history and looks at the evolution of these burial practices. So now, in the remaining 10 minutes here, I'll read a few of these poems for your edification. This one's called Q9, and Q9 is simply the name that archaeologists have given to the earliest Cro-Magnon burial that we know of that took place in Palestine. Okay. Abraham bought a cave from the Hittites to bury his wife Sarah, east of Hebron. At Nazareth, on the west side of a mountain, a parabolic cave yawns a black arch, inside of which, eons older than Abraham and his dusty, shambling martu that walked dim effigies in the sand-blown deserts, lies a protoform Sarah. Behold, she is splayed on her left side, copper bones tracing elegant lines of calcium geodesics, axial vertebrate morphology woven with stone, legs bent at the knees, and below her delicate feet a child etched with solemn care, calligraphic bones of Chinese strokes. The unimaginable grief that broke her soul and wasted her away, the rock still remembers a haiku of melancholy scrawled into a mind so unbearable that it ruined her. The bones are patinaed with red ochre, symbol of the blood that would build new bodies, shaping in the womb axial vertebrate calcium poetry, unfolding petals of mitotic cells, a ball of pink flesh growing orbs and splitting limbs, ramifying neurons and cartilage for new agonies. And maybe next time, the child would become the mother, and the mother would become the child and trade griefs that would splinter their minds into the unexchangeable coinage of infinite loss. So that's Q9, and I thought what we would read next here is a very fascinating burial from the later Paleolithic, a triple burial that's a bit of a mystery. This one's called Trinity. The stream flows past the hill, a stripe of liquid gray metal over a green swale where the sky is made out of schist, and the 5 houses are built out of dark vanilla bones of dead mammoths. Here beneath the swollen ground have been buried 3 skeletons, a crippled woman supine, beside her a man on her left wearing a mask, his hands in her lap, that has been stained pink with ochre, and the crushed skull of the man to her right, a broken bone flower, wooden stake through his pelvis, diagram of an astral accident. The woman in giving birth opened to the ancient darkness that kept pouring forth from between her legs, and her Orpheus went down to the gray shades below to find her, but lost his way in the fog, where the trees looked like people, and the shaman's journey to bring them back was an abortive descent into hell, as the gap of her vulva sealed up behind him, leaving him trapped in the world below. Eons later, after 1,000 turnings of the wheel, such events would be littered with shattered glass, torques of twisted metal, and plastic, as mechanical vehicles are crushed by the physics of Newton. But in the Paleolithic, the highways are astral, and the vehicles are driven by shamans and the wreckage made of bone, blood, and wood. Nevertheless, the tanglings of fate remain the same, and just as difficult to escape. And then this poem here is called Shaman Woman. It's a Natufian burial that takes place at the very end of the Paleolithic as the economy is shifting from that of hunting animals to agriculture. You could remorphologize yourself, vertebrate vertical chassis into the horizontal poetry of a becoming wolf. You could splay your digits and sprout feathers to glide upon enamel skies. You could shed your hominid form to compress your spine. You knew the cartilaginous poetry of boars, martens, and bulls. You were the old world. All the animals slept inside the hexagonal, ovoid, elliptical shells of your cells, but the grasses were your ruin. Your people were Natufians who had followed the dusty herds of gazelles across the acacias, poplars, and mulberry trees of the blue-pink ribbon of the Euphrates. They had conjured forth the new grains, rye, einkorn, emmer wheat, and barley, upon the copper-colored Osirian soils that bled plants. Bowls, cups, plates, mortars, pestles, kerns, all stone dreams made real. Gazelle ribs laced with bitumen flint teeth to slice the grasses. And they haunted the edges of the green horizon inside ashlar block houses stacked near the river. But the grasses were your ruin. And so they cast you forth into the pit. You lay compressed with all your tortoise shells, wing bone of an eagle, forearm of a wild boar, tail of a cow, 2 marten skulls, a basalt plate, and even a severed human foot. They were terrified of you and your laminar animal flows of eagle, bird, fish, tortoise, boar, wolf woman. Limestones were pressed upon the strata covering you, so that you could not rise again, and a single mighty stone atop your grave, a dying world as mortal as the vanilla slabs of the frozen glaciers, animal flows of vertical chassis into horizontal spinal teeth, claws, wings, becomings, extinction. But they were terrified of you. And let's see, it looks like we have time for 1 or 2 more poems here. Let's take a look here at Let's see. Let's take a look here at, I'm going to move to the section on ancient Egypt and take a look at the poem of the netherworld. This is called the Amduat. It's the Egyptian netherworld. Duat was the Egyptian name for the netherworld. And this is my sort of reanimation of their vision of the netherworld as the Amduat. First hour. Above the dark green tree line of the western bank there is a cleft rent into the hills into which the creaking barge of ram-headed Re has gone. That swallower of all has welcomed him as he floats along the heavy purple waters of the subterranean river past 4 incandescent cobras which spit fire at him in greeting. The arms of the baboon arise, and the goddesses of the hours to greet. Mot hails him, for justice reigns even in the realm below, and a parallel mirror-black river where another barge with the scarab beetle worshipped by Osiris is pregnant with the dawn. Second hour. Gods arise with the herald of his luminosity, Khnum, Sekhmet, Tot, Horus, and Set. In the fields of jade-green reeds, peasants stand spine erect with spears of wheat raised. Re stands inside his wobbling reed hut to grant them, these dead, their share of land eternal in the gloaming Duat. Third hour. Osiris seated and cocooned in linen multiplied fourfold and wearing the white crown on chairs in the red dirt. 5 men with glistening skin and serpent heads are holding long flint knives who turn to see him coming. The baboon from the branches comes alive as he is touched by the pale peach-colored gentle flow emanating from the lucent barge. 4 men walking with no arms turn and nod as the boat glides by, and Osiris again multiplied into 4, with the red crown bound to these chairs along the river bank, seated unmoving and impassive. Fourth hour. All at once the river has dried up, the purple flowing water has shrunk into a muddy black silt, and the oarsmen must now get out clambering to haul the barge with long ropes upon their backs. It is Razatau, the land of Sokar, a dry sandy waste of russet dunes and leafless black trees that glow black against a mauve sky. Horus and Sokar bring in the eye upon a tray to watch over the scene as the boat straggles along the ruined river bottom. Fifth hour. The land ahead, colored soft yellow with sand, rises into a tumulus upon which 2 birds, the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, have alighted. Inside the mound, an X-ray reveals that the scarab beetle is caught struggling for birth. The oarsmen heave and sweat to drag the barge past a cliff where a cavernous depth reveals the domain of the ancient god Sokar and the 6-headed serpent which guards it. Beyond, in the rising swale of earth, the ground ends to form a brackish lake filled with burning pits of fire where men are being tortured and burned. Sixth hour. It is midnight and the river waters have resumed flowing, but the waters are a deep charcoal black as they open out into a sea, the abyss known as Nun, an endless cosmic chaotic expanse of waste and ruin. Upon a rust-colored island in the middle is the throne of Osiris, which gleams the color of milk as the cocooned god rests unmoving and silent upon his throne, and at his feet the corpse of Re, his cot, awaits union with the approach of the Ba of Re upon his barge. Nearby the god Tot with a baboon head works upon the eye of Horus to prepare it for rebirth in the world above. It is leaking a dull glow into the dark expanse of the abyss of Nun. Seventh hour. An enormous red and green serpent, the Apophis snake, lies splayed upon the river banks while the god Set cuts it into neat segmented pieces perfectly arranged. Nearby a demon with a cat's head is slicing off the heads of the enemies of Osiris who have dared stand against him, and now they kneel with hands bound behind their backs as the cat demon flays them. The air is murky and dark, but in the blue distance a line of 12 men and 12 women are approaching, each bearing a star that shines white-blue in the gloom with the diminished approach of the sun barge of Re. In the dirty river waters a lumpy, misshapen crocodile is searching for the missing pieces of Osiris. Eighth hour. Cliffs rise ranged along the dark banks with doors entering into tombs hinged upon them, and they crack open at the approach of Re to reveal the human-headed bob-birds inside them, which hail him as his barge passes them by. In the silvery twilight air, a line of women weaving gleaming clothing to apparel the dead in linen shrouds unfolds upon the river banks, and the god Totnan, who is assisting them, is a giant who arises at the approach of the barge, and with 4 ram's heads he snorts as it goes by, then resumes his work amongst the weavers. Ninth hour. In the gloom, a luminous line of 12 cobras emerges, spitting bright orange flames into the air as the barge lumbers creaking by. The oarsmen stand and raise their oars into the air, greeting a line of servants along the banks who are passing by, bearing provisions in pots upon their heads with food for the dead, figs and loaves, cakes and beer, wine and meat. Each stands and stops to marvel at the gathering light as the barge glides by, its light becoming ever stronger and more lucent in the heavy air of the Duat as it moves.